Welcome to the Rob Call Bottom Up Show. It's available on YouTube and Stitcher and SoundCloud and on iTunes. And thank goodness I did this on the bumper because I forgot my main radio, Pacifica Radio, of course. I'm spacing here. Anyway. My guest for the show is Thom Hartmann. Thom Hartmann is a dear friend. He is also one of the smartest people I know. He's a Renaissance man. I mentioned him to another friend who I think is really smart, and he said it too. He's one of the smartest, and he's one of the wisest people I know too. He integrates an incredible range of information and wisdom and knowledge. If you're looking at the video, you can see he's got a lot of old books behind him, the antiquarian books. It's amazing how he has digested them. And he's got a new book out now, The Hidden History of American Healthcare. And it's another great book. Thom has just written so many books. Thom, you and I go back over 25 years now. It's amazing.
Yeah, it's amazing. It really is, Rob. And we have a shared interest in antiquarian books and brain function. You know, I used to love to, every year you and I would get together at your brain conferences, and I would love to see you reboot that. Those were fascinating, but it's great to see you again.
Yeah, it always is. So The Hidden History of American Healthcare. Your website, by the way, is hartmannreport.com, and you now have a subscriber base that is growing quickly. That's great. So what's the goal for this book? Hidden History of American Healthcare.
I wanted to answer the question or the questions. Number one, why is it that out of the 30 or 40, fully developed countries in the world, or at least the 34 OECD countries, why is it that we're the only one that has not declared and put into law that healthcare is a right rather than a privilege? We, by the way, signed a UN charter that said that, 50 years ago. And then the kind of secondary question: if we were to acknowledge that healthcare is a right rather than a privilege, that of course would require the government to make sure that everybody has access to it. And what's the most efficient way to go about doing that? What are the lessons that we can learn from other countries? What are the lessons we can learn from our own history? And so those are the two principal buckets of information in the book. Although it kind of starts out with, how bad things are, how screwed up our system is as well.
So give us 3 of the secrets that the book reveals.
Well, I think number one, there was an amazing study that was published in the Lancet a couple of years ago that documented how we have lost more Americans to being uninsured than we lost in World War II. In fact, than we've lost in all of our wars since World War II. It is, one of the major causes of death, of disease and death in the United States is our healthcare system. It's so screwed up. We have, tens of millions of people who have no health insurance. And then, depending on where you draw your lines and how you define your thresholds, at least 100 million and arguably 200 million people who don't have adequate health insurance. And the consequence of this has been an absolute screaming public health disaster. We are the most expensive in the world. We spend more money on healthcare than any other country in the world, or any other developed country, both in gross numbers and on a per capita basis. We spend roughly twice as much as the citizens of any other developed country, with the single exception of Switzerland, which is kind of an outlier. And it's the average American family is spending $3,000 a year more for healthcare than the average Canadian family does, or the average French or German or Italian family does, and yet they have better outcomes. We rank at the very bottom, for example, in maternal and infant mortality, which is shocking. I mean, that's one of your third world indicators. we're, we average more or less around number 11, I think was the latest study in terms of outcome, from disease. But we're paying, twice as much. So it's just crazy. We're not getting our money's worth. And as a result of that, there's, as the subtitle of the book, why sickness bankrupts you and makes others insanely rich. So just on the surface, we've got a crisis in the United States. And then you overlay that with a pandemic, and which was when I started writing this book, was just coming on. And I think the upside of the pandemic essentially has been that it has, if pandemics can have upsides, is that it has caused a lot of Americans to realize that this one category of individual healthcare that we've always kind of treated in the United States as if it was a standalone, discrete thing, and this other separate category, in fact, other separate area of study, different master's degrees in public health, MPHs, of public health, that really they are far more interrelated than we give credit for. And the experience of other countries that have national healthcare systems demonstrates that. I opened the book with the story of Taiwan. Taiwan has a single payer healthcare system, arguably the best in the world. It was designed by a professor from Princeton who went over there and gave a speech about single payer healthcare shortly after Taiwan became a move from being essentially a military dictatorship to a modern democracy. And a few months later, they called him up and said, "Hey, would you come back over here and help us design this program that you described in your speech?" He did. He had married a Taiwanese woman. He did. He went back to Taiwan for half a year, designed their system from scratch, and they rolled it out. Just did it. And as a result of that, everybody in Taiwan is assigned a sort of like a Social Security number, only it's a healthcare number, at birth, and given an ID card. You can use that card to access your health records at any computer anywhere in the world. You can use that information to pick up your pharmaceuticals, to visit your doctor, to make appointments, to check into the hospital, everything. And because they had this one single national database of everybody in the country, we got our first COVID case here in the Pacific Northwest in the United States on January 20th. They got their first COVID case on January 21st, the day after. And within that first year, by the time this book went off to the typesetter in November of 2020, Taiwan had just a handful of deaths and a few hundred, or I think it was fewer than 500 COVID cases. I was looking at the numbers day before yesterday, and as of 2 days ago, Taiwan has had a little over 16,000 COVID cases. This is a country of 23 million people, 16,000 COVID cases and 837 deaths. Compare that with the United States, where we've had over 600,000 deaths. And I don't remember the exact number, but I think we're in the neighborhood of 40 million known COVID cases. It's mind-boggling, and we're adding more every day. So they were able to use their individual healthcare system as a public health system and get control of a serious pandemic. And because we had nothing like that, and of course we had an incompetent president at the time, Donald Trump, we ended up with 500,000 by the end of Trump's presidency, 500,000 dead Americans.
And in your book, you talk about how the number of people who are either underinsured or non-insured really went up under Trump.
Yeah, well, and we also have the Supreme Court didn't help that at all. When Obamacare expanded Medicaid, there were a couple of states that sued, took it to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, you don't have to do that, you states, you don't have to expand Medicaid. And so we have 12 states, Republican-run states, where there's still not, Medicaid still hasn't been expanded, even though it would cost them almost nothing. The federal government picks up 90% of the tab, but they're just unwilling to do it. And I think to a large extent, these are all former slave states. I think it ties back to most of them are former slave states. It ties back to the reason why we didn't get healthcare in the first place. There have been two eras of fighting against a national healthcare system in the United States. The first was from the 1880s until the 1980s. And then the second was from the 1980s till today. And we had two different groups and two different rationales during those two different time periods, fighting successfully against America having a national healthcare system.
And what's important to put into, as you talk about in your book, is that it was in the 1880s that Germany created the first national health system, right?
Yeah, 1884, Otto von Bismarck. This was before Germany was even a republic. This was the German Empire. And Otto von Bismarck instituted a national single-payer healthcare system because he was trying to build a modern industrial economy and an army and maintain empire. And he needed a healthy populace to do it. And he did his homework and concluded, and this guy is no liberal. I mean, he was a warmonger, empire leader, hardcore right-wing militaristic guy, German. And he concluded that single-payer healthcare was the most efficient and the least expensive way to deliver healthcare to everybody in the country. And so he put it into place in 1884 and defended it loudly. I mean, I quote a couple of his speeches in the book where he was, because people were accusing him of socialism, because Karl Marx, of course, had published Marx and Engels, I think, published the Communist Manifesto in 1846, and Marx published Capital in 1857, as I recall. And so people were saying to Bismarck, "Oh, you're just imitating Marx," and he was like, "The hell I am." So yeah, that's.
But in your book, you talk about how he did say they were kind of taking a little bit of socialism.
Well, what he was pointing out, what Bismarck pointed out, is that there are some things that the government should do, and Marx wanted the government to do everything, right? And Bismarck was saying, I don't want the government making my clothes or my car, but it should run my army and it should pay for our healthcare. And so, yeah.
Now he had a rationale that healthcare was important for the army and for national defense.
Yes, that was the principal way he sold it.
Can you get into that a little bit more?
I could. Oh, I don't have the book right. Oh, here it is. I'm not sure. There are some cool Bismarck quotes in here. Let me just. Bismarck, there we go, 48 to 53. Yeah, I quote him rather extensively in here because he just throws back in their teeth, the arguments that these people make against it. And he says, if one argues against my position that this is socialism, then I do not fear at all. The question is, where do the justifiable limits of state socialism lie? Which is essentially what I just said. What is the commons and what isn't? And he goes on to say, this is Bismarck himself, each law for poor relief is socialism. There are states that distance themselves so far from socialism that poor laws don't exist at all. I remind you of France. And at that time, France was fighting a war. But tuberculosis was ravaging France at that time too. So he goes on to say, he says, in my opinion, a primary reason for the success that the leaders of the real social democracy have had lies in the fact that the state does not promote enough state socialism. It allows a vacuum to form in a place where it should be active. And this is filled by others, by agitators who poke their nose into the state's business. He said, gentlemen, freedom is a vague concept. No one has a use for the freedom to starve. And he says, the expression, if you aren't willing, I'll use force, is totally unjustified. There scarcely exists nowadays a word with which more abuse is committed than the word free. It's like, according to my experience, he says, everyone understands by freedom, these conservatives mean only the freedom for oneself and not for others. In short, by freedom, they actually mean domination. And then he says, the freedom of the princes from the emperor, the power of the nobles over the serfs. That means to be free was for them identical with the concept to dominate. They don't feel for themselves They do not feel themselves free unless they dominate working people. Therefore, whenever I read the word free before another adjective, I become very suspicious.
That sure fits now with all these COVID deniers and mask deniers and vaccine deniers.
And then he concludes it. He says, "Do not doubt that we are acting honorably to strengthen the domestic peace, and particularly the peace between worker and employer, without exposing the Commonwealth to new dangers."
And along those veins, you offer an argument for how to respond to people where the libertarians and the conservatives, where they don't want to pay for other people's being fat or eating too much or smoking cigarettes or drinking or their illness or anything. Right. And you have a great socialist response to that. I love the fire station.
You're talking about the fire stations. Yeah, this is again the commons. What is the stuff that government should do? What is the stuff that we all collectively own? We used to have privatized fire departments, and they would sell you would buy a 1-year subscription, 1 year at a time, and they would give you a shield that you'd put on the front of your house. And if your house caught on fire, the fire trucks, they would come by, and if it wasn't their fire company, or if you didn't have any shield, they just let your house burn down. And then, pretty soon people discovered that when one house burned down, very often it threw off sparks that caught the next house on fire, and, the Chicago fire and all these kinds of things. And so, by the early 20th century, we had pretty much come to the conclusion that putting out fires was the public business. Protecting people's homes was the public business. It wasn't a private business, and it was stupid to run it as a private business. It was inefficient and not effective. And the question I ask is, isn't your body just as valuable as or even more valuable than your home? I mean, if we're going to collectively make sure that everything is good when our home is on fire, what about when our body is on fire? I mean, metaphorically, with disease or injury.
It sure fits in nicely with getting vaccinated too.
Yeah, there is that, which takes us back to the whole public health, private health thing. Yeah, absolutely right.
So we need to take a brief break now for show ID, and then in 30 seconds we'll be back. And my guest for the show is Thom Hartmann. He's an amazing guy. Thom is a Renaissance man. He's one of the wisest, kindest men people I know. And he's got a new book out, The Hidden History of American Healthcare: Why Sickness Bankrupts You and Makes Others Insanely Rich. And we've been talking about how bad things are in the United States. What about the other countries? What do they have that we don't have? Let's spell it out. What's the difference if somebody gets sick in another country and they don't have a lot of money, or if they get sick here? Maybe you can use the example of, I guess I didn't write it in my notes, but you talk about a woman who died of a heart attack.
Oh yeah, that was Charlene Dill in Florida.
Yeah.
This was after the Obamacare expansion, I believe. Yeah, it definitely was. And Rick Scott was the governor of Florida, and he refused to expand Medicaid. If I said Medicare, I meant Medicaid, as part of the Affordable Care Act. He refused to take the federal money and expand Medicaid. And Charlene she had a congenital heart condition that required a small dose of fairly expensive medication. And she was working 3 jobs. 3 part-time jobs. It was all she could pull together. She was trying to raise 3 kids in the trailer that she owned in a trailer park in Florida. And she could not afford her medication. She was cutting her pills in half. And one day she was working her 3rd job, cleaning somebody's house, and she just fell over, dropped dead, of heart failure at 32 or 33 years old. And her best friend, Catherine Woolrich, as I recall, told me, Rick Scott has Charlene's blood on her hands. I think that's a reasonable assertion. In fact, I think the chapter is titled "Rick Scott Killed Charlene Dill." And Rick is, of course, now the senator from Florida. Before he became governor, he was president of a hospital chain that was convicted of the largest Medicare fraud in the history of the United States. Guy with a rather checkered past. But because there's such big bucks to be made in healthcare right now, the industry tends to draw in a lot of grifters like that, essentially.
And this is happening in, there's 12 states you mentioned, where they're refusing to take federal money that's already there. Like, I think for Florida, you said it was about $50 billion a year that Florida turned down.
Right.
Why
Yeah, I
are they
don't recall the
turning it
amount,
down?
but it's a pile of money. Yeah.
Hmm.
And you've got, I think part of this goes back to the 1880 to 1980 reason why we don't have health insurance, which has to do with race. These are mostly states that have significant Black populations and white power structures. And also you've got a group of right-wing billionaires who consider themselves libertarians, and they think that this is overreach by the government to be providing healthcare to people, that it's not an appropriate government function. And even though the phrase general welfare appears twice in the Constitution, in the preamble and in Article 1, Section 8, they discount that, even though George Washington signed the first legislation for federal money to be spent for healthcare. It was for poor people in Washington, D.C. And John Adams signed the first.
I love that historical aspect of healthcare in the Constitution that you talked about in your book. That's
Yeah, and John Adams signed the first single-payer healthcare law, which was for merchant seamen, because at that point in time, in the 1890s, it was so important to the growth of the United States that we have a civilian civilian Navy. I don't know what the right phrase would be, merchant marine, I guess. But private companies, private ships, private seamen, to engage in international trade. But people were constantly getting sick. And so Adams made mandatory, actually, for all the sailors, that they had to be part of this single payer system. So, yeah. And he was our second president. So, there is a history there. But I think the thing that surprised me the most when I was doing the research on the book, and not in that I was shocked by it, because I've ceased to be shocked by how racist this country is, but I was shocked that I didn't know it as somebody who's been on this planet for 70 years, and I think I'm fairly well informed. It was that in the 1880s, the same decade that Bismarck gave Germany their national healthcare system, a guy from Germany, Frederick Ludwig Hoffman, came over to the United States at the age of 17. And he was a savant, a math savant. He was brilliant with numbers. And he got a gig with the Prudential insurance company as an actuary guy. And he started running numbers, and he was the one who discovered the association between working in cotton mills and getting lung fibrosis, smoking cigarettes and getting lung cancer, and being exposed to asbestos and getting the type of lung cancer called mesothelioma, which is what killed my father. And he published his cancer, mesothelioma, and asbestos stuff in the 1890s. And then the asbestos industry basically covered this all up, which is what my dad was exposed to in the 1950s. But he became very famous for that work. He co-founded the American Lung Association. And he also wrote a book about the association between eating a diet high in processed foods and having high rates of cancer. And that book by Frederick Hoffman is still in print. And he died in 1946. That book is still in print. So anyhow, he came over here in the 1880s. In the early 1890s, he met this Southern belle down in Georgia, fell in love, got married. Her family had kind of a plantation history, the kind of Georgia history, and a very, very distinct perspective on on African Americans. And so he decided to run the numbers on why, he's trying to answer the question, why is it that African Americans in the 1890s, got sick more often than white people, got sicker than white people when they did get sick, and died more frequently. And he was able to document those things. I mean, the common sense would indicate that you could document that in the wake of slavery and the failure of Reconstruction. But he drew two conclusions out of it that literally changed American healthcare right up until the 1970s. And the first conclusion that he came to was that the reason for this was not systemic racism or any of the things that we now understand, but and should have been understood back then. They were fairly obvious, but rather that it was because Black people were genetically inferior to white people. This became referred to in the 1920s as scientific racism. He wrote a book about this called Race, Traits, and Tendencies of the American Negro. It was published in 1896, the same year as the Plessy versus Ferguson decision that legally established apartheid in the United States. And he then took that to the next step, and he does this in his book, in Race, Traits, in that book, concludes that therefore, because Blacks are so genetically inferior, and that they were healthy during slavery and they're not healthy anymore, and there's no more slavery, that if we simply prevented them from having access to healthcare, they would eventually die out, and that would solve the race problem in America. And so in and he became quite famous for this. He traveled around the country giving speeches on this. He was, very well thought of because of his work on lung disease and on diet. He had worked his way up to being a vice president of the Prudential company, which was then principally doing life insurance. And he testified before Congress. He testified before state legislatures, always in opposition to any kind of a national healthcare or even a state-based healthcare system. He trashed the German system. He said in his thick German accent, I can tell you it's a terrible system. I'm German. You don't want that. But his main reason was that we need to not have a national healthcare system that might include Black people. So when Teddy Roosevelt in 1912 proposed a national healthcare system as part of his square deal, what got thrown back in his face was, wait a minute, if we have everybody in the country has access to healthcare, Black people will too. And that shut down that conversation. When Franklin Roosevelt proposed the same thing in the 1930s, same thing, same response. What about Black people? When Harry Truman proposed it in 1947, same response. What about Black people? The all-white Congress at that time was not willing to pass any kind of a healthcare system that might benefit Black people, particularly in the South. And so, and in the same thing in 1961 when John Kennedy did, and by that time Frederick Hoffman was long dead, but still people were quoting Hoffman when Kennedy was pitching this in 61. And finally, when LBJ, got Medicare passed in 1965 and put into place in 66, when he was negotiating in 65 with these Southern white racist Southern Democrats, who are all now Republicans, the Dixiecrats, they all flipped after the Civil Rights Act was signed in 64, 65 and the Voting Rights Act. Their thing was, we don't want Black people in our all-white hospitals. We don't want Black people in our all-white doctors' offices. And so therefore, we want to have some skin in the game. We want individual health consumers to have skin in the game. And it was, pun intended. They wanted to be sure that even when you were on Medicare, even if you were over 65, if you were Black, it would still be so expensive to go to the doctor or to the hospital that people wouldn't do it, except in the most dire of emergencies. And so that's why there's a 20% gap in Medicare. Medicare only pays 80%, Part B Medicare only pays 80% of your hospital costs, and it was to keep Black people out of hospitals. So, or at least that was the logic that was put forward by the conservatives, they called themselves in that day. And so, Hoffman lived, right? I mean, his god-awful racist theories lived on. And that took us right up into the 1980s. And then, of course, in 1983, Ronald Reagan stopped enforcing the Sherman Antitrust Act and directed the Justice Department and the Federal Trade Commission to stop enforcing the antitrust laws for all practical purposes. And we went from, at that point, hundreds of health insurance companies across the United States to dozens, within a decade or so. And they became very, very prosperous and very powerful. And so since the 1980s, the principal opposition to a national healthcare system has not been the pre-1980s, oh my God, Black people will get it. Instead, although I think that that's the opposition to the Medicaid expansion, frankly, in those 12 states, but instead it has been, since that time, it's been these big health insurance companies protecting their, billion-dollar-a-week profits. And
of course, now the conservatives have added immigrants and
right,
who are not fully documented.
right, which is insane. I mean, you get these Republicans going, oh, Democrats want to give immigrants, health insurance or healthcare, and it's like, okay, do you think you just can avoid immigrants for the rest of your life? Do you think that you're never going to pass one on the street? I mean, if in this era of contagious diseases and I mean, tuberculosis has been with us for centuries. Do you really want the person coughing next to you not to have access to healthcare, regardless of who they are? I mean, if they're in this country, shouldn't they be healthy? But yeah, so that's it. And since the 1980s, any politician who sticks his head up and says, hey, we should have a national healthcare system, with a single payer, gets their head chopped off by these health insurance companies pouring millions of dollars into advertising campaigns that'll just take them out, basically. They own the Republican Party and a good chunk of the Democratic Party, sadly.
It's sad, really is sad. So talk a little bit about the history, more recent history, about let's talk about Canada and how they did it and how it'll look if and when we ever get it. Now, I've been very involved in single payer for a long time. Been involved in organizations with it, and it's so frustrating because we've come so close in Vermont and California.
Yeah.
So talk about Canada and how they did it, and then why it's been a problem here.
Yeah. Well, in Canada, what happened was Tommy Douglas was a politician from Saskatchewan. He went to Parliament for a number of years, lobbying for a national healthcare system, could never get it through. So he said, screw this. He went back to Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan is sort of like Vermont. It's one of these, it's a fairly large province, but it's very, very small population. And so doing retail politics is very, very possible. When we lived in Vermont, I mean, the first year we lived in Vermont, I think 2 or 3 times I just randomly ran into Bernie Sanders events at the local farmers market or, downtown Burlington, in the park, there would be Bernie, and doing a town hall. Somebody made the comment to me once that he believed that Bernie had shaken every hand in Vermont at least 3 times. I think that's a huge underestimate. But Tommy Douglas went back to Saskatchewan and did the exact same thing. He just got, he started doing his retail politics and convinced the citizens of Saskatchewan that they needed to have a single payer system, and he put it into place. And it worked exactly the way he promised. It was cheaper, it was more effective, everybody was covered. People loved it. In fact, he is the most beloved Canadian in survey after survey after survey. He's Kiefer Sutherland's grandfather, by the way.
Right.
And and he's been dead for decades, and he's still like, he's like the father of Canadian healthcare, and they call their system Medicare. So after Saskatchewan got it, then Alberta and British Columbia were like, hey, we want this, and then Ontario wanted it, and then Newfoundland, and it just kind of spread across the country over the course of the next few years. And eventually the federal government jumped in and said, we're going to backstop all you guys and establish some federal standards and establish some flow through financing systems. So if somebody from Saskatchewan gets sick in Toronto, the Saskatchewan system can pay the Toronto system back for the costs and stuff like that. And so that's the system they have in Canada. And years ago, Bernie told me that on my program on the air that he thought that probably that's how it would happen here in the United States. And that would probably be the best way, because that would be consistent with, Jefferson's idea of the states as laboratories of democracy, of best practices. Each state gets to try their own little tweak, And in Canada, to this day, every state, every province is different. You know, some provinces cover eyeglasses, some cover dental, some don't. You know, they have different copays and actually, I don't think they have copays, but they have, you know, different thresholds and amounts and whatnot. And so Vermont and California both tried to put this into place. Peter Shumlin was the senator in Vermont, state senator. He ran for governor on the platform of giving Vermont a national single-payer healthcare system, or a statewide single-payer healthcare system. He won. He got it passed through the House and Senate, the Vermont State House and Senate. He signed the bill. He hired a friend of mine, actually, to put it into place. And that's when they discovered that this kind of accounting system that LBJ had built into Medicare back in '65 in order to prevent the southern states from taking Medicare money, but not giving healthcare to Black people. So there's this kind of line of accountability from the federal money, both Medicare and Medicaid, to the individual consumer. Even with Medicaid, where it sometimes gets block granted or goes through the states, there's still this kind of accounting line that is very punitive to the states if they screw around with this money, because they were fully expecting the southern states to do exactly that. And as a result of that, when Vermont went single payer or tried to go single payer, that would have meant that they would have given up all of their Medicare and Medicaid money, which was huge. You know, it was just billions and billions of dollars, and it would have bankrupted Vermont if they had to pay for the entire Medicare and Medicaid load on top of all the people who have private health insurance. So there is this movement to get what are called state waivers, state Medicare, Medicaid waivers. That's kind of the plain English. It has to do with ERISA, and there's a bunch of acronyms and weird technical stuff. But bottom line, you can let your legislator know, your U.S. senators, your 2 U.S. senators, or you're a member of the House of Representatives, that you would like Congress to pass these state Medicare, Medicaid waivers so that individual states can put into place single payer systems. And everybody understands what you're talking about. They've been proposed over and over and over again in Congress. And this is what needs to be done. If we can get that.
That's a lot simpler than creating a whole national Medicare program like, let's say, John Conyers worked on with his 676 bill.
That's correct.
This is just a simple waiver that will let states do it where they can't right now.
That's correct. But every time it gets introduced into Congress, the health insurance companies come in, because this is a very real threat to them. They come in and squash it.
What can be done about that?
We have to, I think probably fewer than 5% of Americans even know about what I just told you. In fact, I would be surprised if 3% of Americans know what I just told you. So we need to publicize it. And it's kind of unfortunate when Vermont tried. It was a great moment that could have educated the entire country. Had it been Republicans doing it, they would have taken a lawsuit to the Supreme Court and started a movement and everything else. But instead, Vermont just tried and realized they couldn't, and that was the end of that.
I'm laughing. I'm sorry. You're a stronger defender of Democrats than I am, and what you did just then was a backhand slap at them for not having the guts to stand up and do what Republicans would do.
You're absolutely right, and I'll say that right up front. I'm a defender of the Democrats in as much as I don't see an alternative. I mean, it's and that's why I keep telling people to get inside the Democratic Party. Progressives need to get inside the Democratic Party and take the damn thing over. It's a $1 billion nonprofit corporation that anybody can walk into and become basically an officer of. And yes, there's challenges in various states and in other ways, but it's what we've got to do. But I have no problem calling out the Democrats when they wimp out.
All right. So we need to do another show ID, and we'll be back. And I want to talk a little bit more about the corporate people. You mentioned Wendell Potter in the book, and Wendell's a friend, and I've had him on my show a number of times, and I want you to bring him up. So we'll do our 30-second rest and then come back. Okay, so my guest for this show is Thom Hartmann, a Renaissance man, one of the wisest people I know, and he's got a new book out among his many books. This one is The Hidden History of American Healthcare, Why Sickness Bankrupts You and Makes Others Insanely Rich. And it's one of a series of books about hidden histories that cover a lot of different topics. You want to list a couple of the other ones, Thom?
Guns, the hidden history of voting, and the war on voting, the Supreme Court, the betrayal of America, oligarchy, the rise of oligarchy and tyranny in the United States, and monopolies. And then in 6 months, there'll be one out about Big Brother, about the surveillance state.
All right. So Wendell Potter, talk about him and his connection.
Wendell Potter is a good guy. Wendell has been on my show many times. I've met Wendell. Wendell and I have friends in common. And he was a senior executive with one of the big insurance companies, a very, very well-paid senior executive. And this insurance company got involved in trying to weasel out of paying for an organ transplant. As I recall, it was a liver transplant. I may be wrong, but it was an organ transplant for this teenage girl that Wendell, became involved in this case because it was starting to blow up in their faces publicity-wise. And
well, let me just throw a little bit more. But Wendell was the head of public relations for Cigna.
Right.
And he also was assigned to be the point man, not just for Cigna, but all the healthcare companies to go on the attack against Michael Moore's movie Sicko.
That's true. Yeah, I'm not sure if I referenced that in the book, but yeah. But this teenage girl became sick, and he tried to come to her defense, and he argued within his company that they should pay for this transplant, that the publicity was killing them. And finally, they said, okay, we'll do it. And the day that they said, okay, we'll do it was the day that she died for lack of the transplant. And that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. He left the company. He left probably a 7-figure paycheck and became a whistleblower. And he's written 2 books about his experience doing that. And I kind of summarize one of them in a chapter in this book. And how there are good people in these bad industries, and every now and then some of them stand up and step out and speak out. And Wendell Potter did that. And I know that you know Wendell too, and you've interviewed him.
One time I interviewed him was at the Philadelphia Free Library in front of about 250 people. And what was really interesting is, he was working as a bad guy. He was. And another reason that he quit was he had an epiphany. His family's from the Appalachians, and he went to a county fair where there was a free healthcare offered.
That's right. He tells that story in his book. Yeah.
And he basically saw thousands of people waiting in line, and he realized just how bad it was. And this is where his roots were. Mm-hmm. And I think that was a piece of it too. And
yeah, it's a compelling story.
But when I held that conference, it was basically a conversation between me and him, and then questions from the audience. Somebody in the audience got up and said, "You're no good. You did this for the corporations." And I've seen this happen before. What is wonderful about Wendell is he woke up. Mm-hmm. He woke up and he changed his mind. He changed the way he did things, and he really started a new life.
Yeah, and which is so rare. I mean, that's the redemption story that is you and I share an interest, and we've talked about this for years and years about writing fiction and how narratives, how story. In fact, you used to do a conference on story that I used to speak at. How story is culture and culture is story, and the great story, all good fiction typically is the story of a person who changes. But in reality, 99% of people never change throughout their lives. And Wendell Potter is one of those rare people that could be a hero in a fictional narrative, or actually in this case, a non-fictional narrative.
Yeah, and I wonder who else is out there ready to have that kind of an epiphany, to wake up. You talk in the book about how single payer healthcare or Medicare for all is a key element in the Green New Deal. Talk about that.
Well, I talk about how if you want to get a Green New Deal, get single payer healthcare first. It's I think that it's kind of tying these things together, but the principal thread that I tie those two things together with is pollution. We've got about 10,000 people a year in the United States who die of cancers that we can directly trace back to, or indirectly we can infer, and trace back to tailpipe exhaust and burning fossil fuels. And then there's hundreds of thousands of cases of asthma and lung disease that are associated with that. And those numbers are probably wildly understated. So if we had a national healthcare system, we would be looking at burning fossil fuels as something that is raising our taxes by increasing our healthcare costs. It reminds me of a conversation I had in Denmark with a conservative Danish politician. And when I was doing my show there, and I said, you're a conservative. I'm assuming you must hate the single payer healthcare system here in Denmark. And he's like, what, are you crazy? And I'm like, but you're a conservative. He says, yeah, of course, it's the cheapest way to provide healthcare. Why wouldn't I want that? And so then I said, you must be, I'm looking for something to argue with him about, right? Because I like to debate conservatives. So I said, well, I just noticed, Copenhagen just shut down like 10 or 20% of their streets to car traffic. You can only ride bicycles on a whole bunch of streets now in Copenhagen. I said, you must be really upset at this big government overreach. And he's like, what, are you crazy? And I'm like, I love that. And I'm like, why? And he's, because it's going to lower my taxes. And I'm, what does bike lanes have to do with taxes? And he said, our healthcare system is paid for by our taxes. And if more people ride their bikes to work instead of driving their cars, we're going to have fewer heart attacks and strokes and healthier people. And my taxes will go down. So what's not to like about that? These are conservative principles. And so, if we want to have a healthier population, we need to get off fossil fuels. And and we need to have a single payer healthcare system. And if we had a single payer healthcare system, that it would be one more strong incentive to create a Green New Deal kind of, green power system that doesn't produce all this pollution.
The problem is, this Danish guy is looking at conservative principles of economics. And as you've made clear, the underlying, perhaps major factor of opposition to healthcare for all is racism and classism, I guess, too, really.
Yeah, I think so. And those are big things that are difficult to take on. And I can come up with no other explanation. Well, and the opposition of very wealthy people to having their taxes increased. We can't forget that, because I think that that's driving an awful lot of the so-called libertarian movement within the Republican Party. The fiscal conservatives, really what they mean is low tax conservatives, cheap labor conservatives.
And let's talk about the big lie about how single payer is going to raise your taxes, which is what they say, which is true.
But well, it's true and it's not true. I mean, it's going to,
yes.
There's a variety of ways to pay for it. Elizabeth Warren's plan, I don't believe, raised individual taxes at all. Bernie Sanders's did slightly. But the bottom line is that if you get these for-profit health insurance companies out of the way, these leeches that are sucking about 20% out of the cash that's going through the system out of it and turning it into profits for stockholders and executives, if you got them out of the way, you have a much more efficient, much less expensive system. So, the average American family is spending like I said at the very beginning, about $3,000 a year more for healthcare than the average Canadian family. We would save that money. You may pay, $2,000 a year more in taxes, but that's probably $4,000 or $5,000 a year in health insurance bills that you're not paying, or that your employer is not paying. Your employer may have to pay that in taxes. I mean, there's ways to do this that are not painful to average working people.
Exactly. And let's talk about the employer side of this too, okay? Because let's say you don't pay a penny for healthcare, which a lot of Americans don't because their employers cover it. First of all, I want to point out that there's a slavery system involved with tying employees to to their employers with their health insurance. They can't leave, because if they leave, then they don't have health insurance.
Right.
So it's a horrible system that discourages entrepreneurism and makes the costs for employers just incredibly overpaid. They're paying way too much. And again, it would be a lot less. And the overall cost to our culture, to our country, would be less. And yes, if you're making over $300,000 a year or so, or if you're in the 1%, you're going to pay some more.
Yeah, and that's the bottom line. Is that's how it would work. But moving to a single payer system, or I mean, there's basically three systems out there. There's this hodgepodge, for-profit, mix and match, mishmash that we have here in the United States that just doesn't work. No other country in the world does that. No other developed country does that. There is socialized medicine, which is what they have in the United Kingdom, where the doctors are all employees of the government, directly employed by the government, and the hospitals and many of the doctors' offices are owned by the government. And there is single payer, which is where the government is the one payer. I mean, like, there's a hospital in New York that has roughly the same number of beds as a hospital in Toronto. The one in New York has an entire floor devoted to billing, with, I don't remember how many employees, say 100 employees. And the hospital in Toronto has like one room with 2 desks and 3 people that do all the billing, because there's just one entity that writes the checks. And so, single payer is much more efficient. So anyhow, these three systems, we have all three here in the United States. We've got the hodgepodge for most everybody. We've got socialized medicine in the United States for veterans. That's the VA system, the Veterans Administration system. Doctors in the VA system are employees of the government. The hospitals are owned by the government. And by the way, when you ask people if they're happy with their health care, with their health insurance and the health care that they get, the VA system is the most highly rated in the United States. So our socialized medicine seems to work very well in the United States. And then, of course, we have two single payer systems, two national single payer systems in the United States, Medicare and Medicaid. And either one of those could simply be expanded nationwide, encompass everybody. With Medicaid, you would simply take away the income limits and make it available to everybody. And with Medicare, you would just drop the age restriction down to 0 and make it available to everybody, and fill in that 20% hole.
Let's talk about that 20% hole and Medicare Advantage, because you got a very strong point on that. And I think everybody needs to hear about it, especially if they're about to go on Medicare.
Yeah, Medicare Advantage is a scam. It's not Medicare. It is private health insurance that is allowed to be branded with the word Medicare. And the companies are reimbursed by Medicare at rates that are much higher than normal Medicare recipients are using. It's much more expensive to the federal government. It drains resources out of Medicare very, very rapidly. It's damaging our Medicare system. It is almost impossible to get out of once you get into it.
Now let's be clear what that means. You're turned 65, you look at the options. You can pay $200 for a supplement program, or you can pay nothing, or $30 or $40 or $50 for an Advantage program that may even throw in some free dental and eye care.
Right. The Advantage program is regular commercial health insurance. So if they have in-network doctors and out-of-network doctors, you've got to be sure you get an in-network doctor. If they're regional and you're outside the region, you could get really badly financially screwed. If you've got these games that hospitals play, sometimes intentional, sometimes unintentional, where you show up and you think that the hospital and your doctor and everything is approved. And then after you get the bill and you see that there's a $10,000 bill for the anesthesiologist that your health insurance company won't pay for because he's out of network, but you never even met him. I mean, you were unconscious, right? So you had no idea. So Medicare Advantage has all those problems. And the other thing is that because Medicare Parts A and B has this Part B has this 20% gap. Health insurance companies sell Medigap policies that fill that gap. They're heavily regulated. They go all the way back to the beginning of Medicare. And so they can't screw you. And they can't refuse to write a policy for you when you turn 65 if you have pre-existing conditions. But here's the gotcha. If you sign up for Medicare Advantage when you turn 65, and then when you develop, or you already have, diabetes or heart disease or arthritis or whatever it may be, and a year or two or three down the road, you decide you want to go back to regular Medicare and get a Medigap policy to fill in that 20%, they can refuse to sell you the Medigap policy because you now have a pre-existing condition.
So I was lucky. I was lucky because I started the first year with an Advantage program because it looked like a good deal to me. But then I had an injury. I had to go for surgery. I had to go to a lot of special. I tore my hamstring playing racquetball. Mm-hmm. And I had to go through rehab, and the copays were killing me. And any savings I had from the Advantage program were lost. So I went back and I was able to switch. And so I guess I was pretty lucky then because I didn't have any pre-existing conditions. So
yeah, and that window I think lasts a year. I'm not, I'm a reporter, not a Medicare expert. So the information is in the book, but I don't carry it all in my brain all the time.
But the bottom line is, if you're about to start on Medicare, the worst thing you can do for yourself is to save a couple bucks and get an Advantage program.
That's correct, because it's not real Medicare, and they will screw you if they have a chance.
And really, as we're coming to the end of this, they will screw you is a common theme in American healthcare, isn't it?
Well, it's a common theme in American business. I mean, since the greed is good era of the 80s, since Reagan really kind of reinvented America, since the Reagan Revolution, American business has gone from, it's like service is dead, customer service is dead, quality products are dead. Everything is a hustle. Even starting businesses, entrepreneurs don't start businesses with the thought that they're going to serve their customers and their community, and they're going to build a nice little business and pass it down to their children and their grandchildren. Instead, it's how quickly can we grow this thing before the giant companies squash us like a bug? How quickly can we grow it to get it to the point where they're going to want to buy us out? Yeah. And that's no way to run an economy. But and of course that's happening in healthcare just like everywhere else.
Last words.
I think that there's a lot of really, really useful information in this book. It's not just a how-to manual for Medicare for all, although it is. If you want to be
my review of this book is, as any book Thom writes, it's loaded with stories, it's loaded with history, it gives you background and context that you never find in most books. And it's a quick, easy read with a lot of powerful information, and really there are secrets that you wouldn't even think about. So get the book.
Yeah, thank you. The Hidden History of American Healthcare: Why Sickness Bankrupts You and Makes Others Insanely Rich.
And your website again?
HartmanReport.com.
HartmanReport.com. My guest for the show has been Thom Hartmann. He's the author of his newest book, The Hidden History of American Healthcare: Why Sickness Bankrupts You and Makes Others Insanely Rich. Thanks again, Thom. It's always great to have you on the show.
Thanks, Rob. It's great seeing you. Great talking with you again.